They were thrown away like garbage by the children they'd sacrificed everything to raise. Forced into an abandoned house with rotting walls and no heat, only to discover that beneath their feet lay a secret worth $234 million. That would change everything. Before we explore this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The autumn wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Harold Brennan sat in the passenger seat of a borrowed pickup truck, his weathered hands folded in his lap, knuckles swollen from a lifetime of honest work. He was 73 years old, tall but stooped now, with shoulders that had carried heavy burdens for too long. His face was lined like a map of hard years, each wrinkle a story of sacrifice, each gray hair earned through worry and work. And for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to call home. Beside him, his wife Ruth clutched a cardboard box filled with photographs, the only possessions they'd been allowed to take. She was 71, small-boned and silver-haired, with eyes that had once sparkled with warmth, but now held only a hollow emptiness. She'd cried herself dry 3 days ago. Now those eyes just stared ahead, vacant and distant, as if her soul had retreated somewhere safe inside, where disappointment couldn't reach. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the box, and every few minutes she'd touch the photographs through the cardboard, as if making sure they were still real, still there. The truck belonged to Dennis Cooper, an old friend from Harold's factory days, back when both men had strong backs and full heads of hair. Dennis hadn't asked many questions when Harold called, voice breaking, asking for help. He just showed up at dawn with his truck and a thermos of coffee, the way good men do. That's what real family did. Not like the children Harold and Ruth had raised, fed, clothed, and put through college with money they didn't have. Not like Michael and Jennifer, who had sat across from them in a lawyer's office just 1 week ago and stripped them of everything with signatures and legal papers, and eyes as cold as January ice. The house they'd lived in for 42 years, the one Harold built with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail, working weekends and evenings after his factory shifts. Gone. Transferred to Michael through legal documents Ruth didn't understand and couldn't fight. Papers with words like conservatorship and incompetent and in the best interest of the elderly parties. The savings account they'd scraped together through decades of double shifts and denied luxuries. Every dollar saved from skipped meals and patched clothes, and birthdays celebrated with homemade cake instead of store-bought, drained. Jennifer had been made power of attorney during Ruth's brief hospital stay last year after her hip surgery, and she'd cleaned it out systematically, coldly, transferring funds with the efficiency of someone harvesting a crop, not destroying their parents' security. When Harold confronted them, when he stood in that sterile office with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and demanded to know how they could do this, Michael didn't even look up from his phone. He just kept scrolling, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced indifference, his expensive suit perfect, his hair styled, his manicured nails catching the light. "You're getting old, Dad," he'd said flatly, still not looking up. "You can't manage things anymore. You left the stove on twice last month. Mom fell in the shower. You're a danger to yourselves. We're doing what's best." Jennifer at least had the decency to fake concern, though her eyes never quite matched the sympathetic expression she'd arranged on her face. "You'll be taken care of," she'd said, reaching out to touch Ruth's hand with fingers that felt like ice despite the warm room. We've arranged a place for you. Oakwood Senior Living. It's very nice, clean, safe. You'll have everything you need. The place was Oakwood Senior Living, a state-run facility 3 hours away from everyone they knew. From the town they'd called home for 5 decades. From the church where they'd been married. From the cemetery where Harold's parents were buried. The rooms were 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than most prison cells. The food was served on plastic trays at specific times, whether you were hungry or not. Visitors were allowed on Sundays, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, as if love and family could be scheduled like a dental appointment. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and despair, and the residents sat in wheelchairs along the walls like forgotten furniture. Eyes vacant, mouths slack, warehoused until they stopped breathing. Harold had visited once, taken the bus out there on a rainy Tuesday, to see what his children had arranged for them. He'd walked those halls, seen the tiny rooms with their single beds and their shared bathrooms, watched the nurses hurry past residents who called out for help that never came. He'd seen the vacant eyes of people who'd been left there by families who visited less and less until they stopped visiting at all. People who'd once had lives and jobs and grandchildren, now reduced to a name on a door and a chart on a clipboard. He'd stood in the common room, where a television played to an audience that had stopped watching years ago, and he'd known with absolute certainty that he would rather die than live like that. He told Michael and Jennifer they wouldn't go, that they'd find another way, that they were still capable, still sharp, still able to take care of themselves. That's when Michael smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile a snake might give a mouse. Then, you'll figure it out on your own, he'd said, finally looking up from his phone. The house is sold. The account is closed. You've got until Friday to get your things out. After that, anything left behind becomes property of the new owners. And just like that, they were homeless. 73 and 71 years old, with a combined 144 years of life experience, and they were on the street, like vagrants, like people who'd made bad choices and burned bridges and squandered opportunities. Except they hadn't. They'd done everything right. They'd worked hard, paid their taxes, raised their children, stayed married. They'd played by every rule society had given them. And still, they'd ended up here, in a borrowed truck, with a box of photographs, and nowhere to go. Dennis slowed the truck as they turned onto a narrow dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years, maybe decades. Branches scraped the sides of the vehicle with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. Deep potholes jarred them violently, making Ruth gasp and clutch the box tighter. The road seemed to go on forever, winding through dense woods where the late afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy of leaves, turning gold and red and brown. "You sure about this?" Dennis asked quietly, his voice rough with concern and something that might have been anger on their behalf. He'd offered to let them stay with him, but his apartment was small, and he had his own troubles. A disabled son, medical bills, barely making ends meet himself. Harold nodded, throat too tight to speak. They didn't have a choice. This was the only option left. Ruth said nothing. She hadn't said much of anything since the day they'd been forced to leave their home. It was like something had broken inside her, something essential and irreparable. The spark that had made her Ruth. The woman who sang while doing dishes, who left notes in Harold's lunch pail, who could make a whole meal from leftovers and love. That spark had dimmed to almost nothing. Harold reached over and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, but weakly, automatically, like a reflex that no longer carried meaning. The house appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare, like something that had been abandoned not just by people, but by hope itself. It was a 2-story farmhouse, probably built in the 1930s or 40s, with peeling white paint that hung in long strips like dead skin. The front porch sagged in the middle. The wood rotted through in places, creating dark holes that looked like missing teeth in a diseased mouth. Several windows were broken, the glass long gone, leaving dark, empty eyes staring out at nothing. The roof looked like it had missing shingles, and in places Harold could see through to the rafters beneath. Weeds grew waist-high in what had once been a yard, creating a jungle of brown stalks and thorny vines that grabbed at anything that passed. Dennis pulled up as close as he could get and killed the engine. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the rustle of wind through dead vegetation. Then Harold opened his door, the creak of the hinges loud in the stillness. "Let's see what we've got," he said, trying to sound confident, trying to sound like this was just another project, just another problem to solve. But his voice came out hollow, and he couldn't quite meet Dennis's eyes. The house belonged to no one, technically. It had been abandoned for nearly 20 years after the last owner died without heirs, without anyone to claim it, without anyone who cared enough to take on the burden of taxes and repairs and memories. The county had tried to auction it off twice, but no one wanted it. Too remote, too far from town, too far from jobs and schools and civilization. Too damaged, the roof compromised, the foundation questionable, the plumbing and electrical systems decades past their useful life. Too much work for too little return. The county had eventually given up, leaving it to slowly collapse under the weight of time and weather and neglect. Harold had heard about it from a guy at the Veterans Hall, old Thomas Whitmore, who said if someone just moved in and paid the back taxes, which amounted to less than $2,000, the county probably wouldn't care, might even be grateful to have someone taking responsibility for it. Squatters' rights, adverse possession, legal terms for what amounted to the desperate finding shelter where no one else wanted it. That's what Harold and Ruth had been reduced to. Squatters, trespassers, in a house no one else would touch. Dennis helped them unload their few belongings from the truck bed. 2 suitcases of clothes, worn but clean, packed with everything they owned now. The box of photographs that Ruth refused to let go of. Images of better days, of children who used to smile at them, of Christmases and birthdays and graduations that seemed like they'd happened to different people in a different life. Ruth's Bible, its cover worn soft from decades of reading, pages marked with underlined verses that had once brought comfort. Harold's toolbox, battered red metal covered in dents and scratches, filled with instruments he'd used to build and fix and create for 50 years. Everything else was gone. The furniture they'd bought piece by piece over decades. The dishes they'd received as wedding presents. The quilts Ruth's mother had made. The photo albums. The books. The small treasures that marked a life together. All of it left behind in the house that was no longer theirs. Soon to be discarded or sold by strangers who wouldn't know or care about the memories attached to each item. Inside, the house smelled of mold and rodent droppings and decay, a thick organic stench that made Ruth cover her mouth and turn away. The floorboards creaked ominously under their weight, some of them soft and spongy with rot, threatening to give way with each step. There was no electricity. Of course, the lines had been disconnected decades ago. No running water. the pipes frozen and burst long ago. The windows that weren't broken were so dirty they barely let in light, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the afternoon. A family of raccoons had been living in the kitchen, and they'd left their mark everywhere. Torn bags, scattered debris, droppings in the corners, a nest made of shredded insulation, and newspaper in what had once been a cabinet. But there were 4 walls, mostly intact despite the holes, and a roof, sagging but present, keeping out most of the rain. It was shelter. Barely, marginally, but shelter nonetheless. It was more than they'd have sleeping in Dennis's truck, or under a bridge, or in one of those homeless shelters where your possessions got stolen and your dignity got stripped away piece by piece. Harold walked through the rooms slowly, his contractor's eye assessing the damage with grim determination. It was bad, worse than he'd hoped, but not as bad as he'd feared. The foundation seemed solid. That was something. The frame was intact, the studs straight. During the Depression, his grandfather had raised 6 kids in a house not much better than this. He'd told Harold stories about winters when ice formed on the inside of the windows, about meals that consisted of bread and lard, about making do with nothing and being grateful for it. People survived. People endured. Humans were resilient when they had no other choice. Ruth stood in what had once been the living room, still holding her box of photographs, looking so small and fragile she seemed in danger of disappearing entirely. She looked around at the water-stained walls, at the ceiling with its ominous brown spots indicating roof leaks, at the floor covered in debris and dirt, and the remnants of animal habitation. A strong wind might carry her away, Harold thought. She'd lost so much weight since the betrayal, stress burning through her like acid, appetite gone, sleep impossible. Her clothes hung on her frame now, and her wedding ring kept sliding around her finger, too loose. "We'll make it work," Harold said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. His voice echoed in the empty room, hollow and unconvincing. She nodded, but her eyes were somewhere else, somewhere far away, perhaps back in the home they'd built together, the home that was now occupied by strangers who'd never know that Harold had installed every cabinet, that Ruth had planted the roses by the front door, that their children had taken their first steps on that living room floor. Dennis left them with a promise to come back in a few days with some supplies. He pressed $200 into Harold's hand, bills he couldn't afford to give. "Just until you get on your feet," he said gruffly, not meeting Harold's eyes, because they both knew Harold might never get back on his feet at his age, with no savings and no prospects. As his truck disappeared down the dirt road, Harold felt the weight of their situation settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing, like someone had loaded 100 pounds of concrete onto his back. They were old. They were alone. They had been betrayed by the people they loved most. And winter was coming. Already Harold could feel it in the air, that sharp edge that promised snow and ice and temperatures that could kill. That first night, they slept on the floor wrapped in the blankets Dennis had left them, thin things that did little to keep out the cold that seeped up through the floorboards. The house creaked and groaned around them like a living thing, wood expanding and contracting, old nails shifting in old wood, sounds that in the darkness seemed ominous and threatening. Ruth cried silently in the darkness, her body shaking with suppressed sobs, and Harold held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. No words of comfort would change their reality. No promises would make this better. They'd been discarded, thrown away, their worth calculated, and found lacking by their own flesh and blood. When dawn finally broke through the broken windows, pale and cold, and offering no warmth. Harold rose stiff and aching. He was too old to be sleeping on floors, his back screaming in protest, his joints swollen and reluctant, but complaining wouldn't change anything. Self-pity was a luxury they couldn't afford. He found a broom with half its bristles missing leaning in a corner, and began sweeping out the debris, broken glass that crunched under his feet, dead leaves that had blown in through broken windows, the remnants of animal nests made of paper and fabric and insulation. Each sweep of the broom raised clouds of dust that made him cough. But he kept working because work was all he had left. Work and Ruth. Ruth eventually joined him, moving slowly, mechanically, like a wind-up toy running down. They worked in silence, no energy for conversation, no words that seemed adequate. By afternoon, they'd cleared enough space in 2 rooms to be marginally livable. Harold managed to get the old hand pump in the kitchen working after an hour of cursing and wrestling with corroded parts. Rusty water sputtered out, brown and thick with sediment. But eventually it ran clearer. It would need to be boiled before drinking, but it was something. It was water where before there'd been nothing. As the sun began to set, painting the dirty windows in shades of orange and gold, Harold made a small fire in the old stone fireplace. It drew poorly, filling the room with smoke before he managed to adjust the flue, hands fumbling in the darkness of the chimney, finding the lever by touch and prayer. But eventually the smoke cleared and the warmth was real. A small circle of heat in the cold house. For the first time since they'd arrived, Ruth sat down close to the flames and seemed to relax slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Do you think they'll come looking for us?" she asked quietly, her first words in hours. Harold knew she meant Michael and Jennifer. He shook his head. No, they got what they wanted. Ruth was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Then, almost whispering, she said, "How did we raise such cruel children?" Harold had asked himself that question 1,000 times, lying awake in the darkness, replaying moments from their childhood, searching for where they'd gone wrong. They'd given those kids everything. Love in abundance, affection freely given, support for every dream and aspiration. Opportunities Harold and Ruth never had. College educations and nice clothes and cars and vacations. Michael had become a real estate attorney, successful by any measure, living in a house with 6 bedrooms and a pool. Jennifer was a financial advisor, managing other people's money with skill and precision. Both successful, both cold, both capable of looking at their parents and seeing only inconvenient obligations to be disposed of efficiently. "I don't know," Harold admitted, his voice rough. "But it's not our fault. We did right by them. We gave them everything we had. What they became, that's on them. We can't take responsibility for their choices." That night, lying on the hard floor again, Harold stared at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness, and thought about the trajectory of his life. He'd worked in factories for 47 years, starting when he was 19, straight out of high school. Came home every night, smelling like motor oil and metal shavings, his hands cut and bruised, his back aching, his ears ringing from the constant noise of machines. Never missed a day unless he was literally unable to stand. Never complained, never asked for special treatment. Just showed up and did the work and collected his paycheck and did it all again the next day. He'd built a good life for his family with those paychecks. A safe life, a stable life, a house and food and clothes and education, and everything the American dream promised would be enough. And in 1 week, It had all been stolen by the people he'd worked so hard to provide for. The unfairness of it burned in his chest like acid, eating away at something essential. But beneath the anger was something else, something deeper and more painful, a profound sadness that felt like drowning, like being pulled under by cold water, and not having the strength to fight your way back to the surface. The next morning, Harold began the real work of making the house livable, or at least survivable. He patched broken windows with cardboard and duct tape, using supplies from Dennis and materials he found in the shed out back. He cleared the raccoon nest from the kitchen, wearing gloves and trying not to breathe the dust, disposing of it far from the house. He found the source of a water leak in the upstairs bathroom, a cracked pipe, and jury-rigged a temporary fix, with rubber and wire and hope, knowing it wouldn't last but might hold through the winter. Ruth cleaned what could be cleaned, scrubbing floors and walls with water from the pump and rags torn from old clothing. She organized their meager possessions with quiet efficiency, creating order from chaos, making corners of the house feel almost home-like. It was what she'd always done: create homes from nothing, make do with what they had, transform spaces into places of warmth and welcome. But now there was no warmth in her movements, just mechanical precision, like she was going through motions she'd learned long ago but no longer understood. On the third day, Dennis returned with supplies as promised: canned food that would keep, batteries for flashlights, candles for light, a small camping stove for cooking. He'd also brought news, and his face was troubled as he delivered it. "Your kids have been calling around town," Dennis said carefully, not quite meeting Harold's eyes, "asking if anyone's seen you. Told them I hadn't." Harold felt a cold twist in his gut, fear mixing with anger. "What do they want?" Dennis shrugged uncomfortably. "Don't know for certain, but Jennifer left a message with Thompson at the gas station. Said they need you to sign some papers. Something about life insurance policies needing updating, of course." There was still something left to take, still some final bit of security they could strip away. Not content with the house and the savings, they wanted to make sure they'd profit from their parents' deaths too. Collect on policies Harold had paid into for 40 years, policies meant to ensure Ruth would be taken care of if something happened to him. Harold thanked Dennis and asked him not to tell anyone where they were. Dennis nodded solemnly. "You got it, brother. But Harold, real talk, this can't be permanent. Winter's coming hard this year, Almanac says so. And this place won't hold heat worth a damn. You're going to freeze when it really gets cold." "We'll manage," Harold said, though he had no idea how. He just knew he couldn't think about that problem yet, couldn't add it to the weight already crushing him. After Dennis left, his truck disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, Harold explored more of the house, needing to understand what they were working with, what repairs were most urgent. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms, all with water damage, ceilings stained brown and yellow, plaster crumbling in places. The bathroom fixtures were rusted solid, the toilet unusable, the sink frozen. But in the back bedroom, the smallest one, tucked into the corner of the house, Harold found something interesting. The closet floor sounded hollow when he walked on it. He stopped, stood still, listening. Then he stepped again, deliberately, weight shifting. The sound was unmistakable, hollow space beneath. The floor in the rest of the room was solid, the sound of his footsteps normal. But here in the closet, something was different. He knelt down and examined the boards carefully, running his hands over them, looking for seams or gaps or anything unusual. The boards were newer than the rest of the floor, he realized. Installed maybe 15 or 20 years ago, based on the lack of wear. And they weren't nailed down properly. He could see gaps where nails should be, places where the boards simply rested on the joists beneath. Curious, Harold found a screwdriver in his toolbox and began to pry up one of the boards. It came up easily, too easily, and beneath it was not the crawl space he expected, but darkness and a smell of earth and stone, cold air rising from below like breath from a cave. He grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox and shined it down into the opening. His breath caught in his throat. There was a space under the floor, but not a normal crawl space. This was deliberate construction. Stone walls, fitted together with old mortar, and steps, stone steps, descending into darkness. Harold's heart began to pound, though he wasn't sure why. Something about this felt significant, felt important in a way he couldn't name. He called for Ruth. She came slowly, warily, climbing the stairs with one hand on the rail, breath labored. When she reached the bedroom, Harold was pulling up more boards, widening the opening. "What is it?" she asked, the first real curiosity he'd heard in her voice since the betrayal. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to the opening. She peered down at the steps, frowning. The stone was old but well maintained. No crumbling, no signs of deterioration. This wasn't something abandoned. This was something that had been cared for, protected. "What is that? A basement?" Ruth asked. "This house doesn't have a basement," Harold said. "At least not one with an entrance from the main floor. I looked at the property records before we came. Single-story foundation, crawl space only. But this..." He shined the flashlight down, and they could see the steps continued beyond the beam's reach, descending into deeper darkness. They stared at the opening for a long moment. Then Ruth said something that made Harold's skin prickle. "Harold, look at the walls." He turned the flashlight to the stone walls of the stairwell. Ruth was right. There was something odd about them. They were too well constructed for a simple basement. The stones were fitted together with precision, with care, with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested this was important, that whoever built this had taken their time, had wanted it to last. And then Harold noticed something else. The mortar between the stones. It wasn't crumbling like it should be after decades. It looked almost fresh, maintained, preserved. "Someone's been taking care of this," he said quietly. "But the house has been abandoned for 20 years, Ruth said, voice tight, with something that might have been fear. They looked at each other in the dim light of the bedroom, and Harold saw his own confusion and growing unease reflected in Ruth's face. Why would someone maintain a hidden staircase in an abandoned house? What was down there that needed protection, preservation, secrecy? "We should probably just board it back up," Ruth said. "Forget we found it." But even as she said it, Harold could see in her eyes that she didn't mean it. After everything they'd lost, after being stripped of their home and their savings and their dignity, here was something mysterious, something hidden, something that might matter. They were too far down to turn away from questions now. "Tomorrow," Harold said, making a decision. "Tomorrow, when we have more daylight, we'll go down, see what's there." Ruth nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, Harold saw a flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't just emptiness. Curiosity, interest, maybe even hope. They replaced the boards carefully that night, covering the opening, but neither of them could sleep. They lay in the darkness, and Harold knew Ruth was awake too, both of them thinking about the stone steps descending into darkness, about what secrets this forgotten house might hold, about what they might find when the morning came. Morning came slowly, the pale November sun struggling to penetrate the dirty windows of the abandoned house. Harold was awake before dawn, lying on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the stone steps hidden beneath the bedroom floor. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those precisely fitted stones, those well-maintained walls, that darkness descending into unknown depths. Beside him, Ruth stirred. And he knew she hadn't slept either. They didn't speak as they rose, joints protesting, bodies stiff from another night on the floor. Harold made weak coffee on the camping stove, instant crystals dissolved in water heated to barely lukewarm. They ate crackers from one of the cans Dennis had brought, neither tasting the food, both lost in thought about what waited upstairs. When they could delay no longer, when the sun had risen enough to provide real light, Harold gathered his flashlight, checked the batteries, and nodded to Ruth. Ready? She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, the house cold enough to see their breath, and followed him up the stairs. Each step creaked under their weight, announcing their passage. In the back bedroom, Harold knelt and pulled up the loose floorboards again, revealing the opening they'd discovered the day before. In the morning light, it looked less ominous, but no less mysterious. "Let me go first," Harold said. "Make sure it's safe. If anything happens, if I call out, you get Dennis. You understand?" Ruth nodded, her face pale but determined. That spark he'd thought was gone forever flickered in her eyes again. Whatever was down there, whatever they were about to discover, it had given her something back. Purpose, maybe, or just distraction from the pain of their betrayal. Harold descended the stone steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight on it. The flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing stone walls on either side, close enough to touch. The air grew colder as he went down, but it was dry, surprisingly so. No musty smell of water damage or rot, just cool, still air that tasted of stone and earth and secrets kept for decades. The stairway was longer than he expected, at least 20 steps down, maybe more. He counted under his breath. 15, 16, 17. At step 23, the stairs ended, and Harold found himself standing on a level floor. He swept the flashlight around, trying to understand what he was seeing. A tunnel. Not a basement, not a cellar, but a tunnel, carved through earth and lined with stone. The ceiling was arched, maybe 7 feet high at its peak. The walls fitted together with the same precise craftsmanship as the stairwell, and it stretched in both directions, far beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. "Harold?" Ruth's voice echoed down from above, tight with worry. "I'm okay," he called back. "But Ruth, you need to see this. Come down. Slowly." "Man." She descended carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. When she reached the bottom and saw the tunnel stretching into darkness, she gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "What is this place?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might wake something sleeping in the dark. "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But someone built this. Someone went to a lot of trouble. This is serious construction, not some amateur digging." They stood at the base of the stairs for a long moment, the weight of discovery pressing down on them. Then Harold made a decision. "We follow it. See where it goes." He chose the direction that seemed to lead away from the house. Deeper. Under the property. Ruth stayed close behind him, one hand gripping his jacket. Both of them walking slowly, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth. The tunnel was remarkably well preserved, the stone walls solid, no signs of collapse or deterioration, no water damage, despite being underground. Someone had engineered this to last, had taken precautions against time and moisture and earth pressure. They walked for what felt like several minutes, Harold counting steps in his head. 100 steps, 200, 300. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching into darkness that retreated before them like a living thing. Harold's heart pounded, his mouth dry. What were they walking toward? And more importantly, why had someone built a tunnel this long, this well-made, hidden beneath an abandoned house? At step 412, the flashlight beam caught something ahead. A door. Harold stopped so abruptly that Ruth bumped into his back. "What is it?" she asked. Harold couldn't speak for a moment. The door wasn't like anything he'd expected. It was metal, heavy, industrial, and it had a wheel lock on it, like something from a bank vault or a submarine. A circular mechanism that looked like it weighed 50 pounds. The metal was dull with age but not rusted, as if it had been treated with something to preserve it. They approached slowly, Harold's hand shaking as he reached out to touch the cold metal. The wheel was about 2 feet in diameter, with handles welded onto it for grip. Along the top of the door, barely visible in the flashlight beam, were numbers stamped into the metal. 1, 9, 7, 8. 1978. Ruth whispered. This was installed in 1978. Harold's mind raced. The house had been abandoned in 2003, Dennis had said. That meant this door had been here for at least 25 years while people were still living in the house. Someone had installed this, used this tunnel, maintained it, all while living their normal life above ground. "Harold," Ruth said, her voice strange, "I don't think we should open it." But Harold was already gripping the wheel. His hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from something else. Anticipation, dread, the sense that whatever was behind this door would change everything. That they were standing at a threshold they couldn't uncross once they'd stepped over it. "We have to know," he said quietly. The wheel was cold under his palms, the metal seeming to draw heat from his skin. He pulled, expecting it to be frozen, seized by decades of disuse. For a moment, nothing happened, and he thought maybe that was for the best. Maybe they should just walk back up those stairs and pretend they'd never found this place. Then, with a groan of metal on metal, the wheel began to turn. It moved easier than it should have, as if someone had maintained it, oiled it, kept it functional. Harold's breath came faster as he turned, the mechanism clicking with each rotation, some internal locking system disengaging piece by piece. Ruth's hand found his shoulder, gripping tight. Whether to stop him or support him, he wasn't sure. After 3 complete rotations, something deep inside the door clicked heavily, definitively. Harold pulled the handle, and the door swung open with surprising ease, its hinges well oiled despite everything. Beyond it was darkness so complete that Harold's flashlight seemed to barely penetrate it, the beams swallowed by whatever space waited on the other side. He stepped through, Ruth close behind, almost stepping on his heels. The flashlight beam swept across the space, and Harold's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It was a room, large, maybe 30 feet by 30 feet. The ceiling was supported by thick wooden beams, and the walls were the same fitted stone as the tunnel. But it was what filled the room that made Harold's legs go weak, that made his grip on the flashlight falter for a moment. Shelves. Metal shelving units lined every wall, the kind you'd see in a warehouse or a storeroom. And on those shelves were stacks of something wrapped in plastic, bundles about the size of bricks. each one sealed tight and labeled with strips of paper that had yellowed with age. Harold approached the nearest shelf slowly, like he was walking through a dream. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up one of the bundles. Through the thick plastic, he could see what was inside. Currency. Bills. United States currency, tightly bound and preserved. He turned the bundle over in his hands, and on the label someone had written in neat handwriting, $10,000, hundreds, 1976. The bundle dropped from his fingers, hitting the stone floor with a soft thud. Ruth made a sound behind him, something between a gasp and a sob. Harold turned to see she'd picked up another bundle, and another, her hands moving mechanically, pulling them from shelves, staring at them in disbelief. "Harold," she breathed. "Harold, what is this?" But Harold couldn't answer. He was already moving deeper into the room, his flashlight sweeping across shelf after shelf. Each one was packed with bundles, dozens of bundles per shelf. And there were so many shelves, lining the walls from floor to ceiling, stretching into corners and shadows. His contractor's brain, trained to estimate materials and calculate costs, started doing math automatically, even as his conscious mind reeled. Each bundle was $10,000. Each shelf looked like it held maybe 50 bundles. That was $500,000 per shelf. And there were dozens of shelves. Maybe 100 or more. He couldn't count them all, couldn't make his eyes focus properly. The room spun around him. Harold staggered, reaching out to steady himself against a shelf. The metal was cold under his hand, solid, real. This was real. This wasn't a dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and hunger and sleeping on cold floors. This was actually happening. "Oh my God," Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible. "Harold, there's so much. There's so much money here." Harold forced himself to breathe, to think. He moved methodically now, shining his light across the shelves, trying to count. The bills were mostly hundreds. He could see through the plastic. Some were 50s. All old, all preserved, sealed against moisture and time. Whoever had stored this here had taken extraordinary care to protect it. 10 bundles to a row, 5 rows to a shelf, 10 shelves on this wall. That was $5 million on one wall. He turned, counted the next wall. Another 10 shelves, another 5 million. His breath came faster, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Ruth had found something else. She stood in the corner of the room, looking down at a small table he hadn't noticed before. On it was a ledger, the kind accountants used before computers, bound in leather and thick with pages. "Harold," she said, her voice strange. "Come, look at this." He joined her, shining his light down on the open ledger. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, notations. At the top of the page, in larger letters, someone had written, "Collection Inventory, updated January 2003. Harold's hands shook as he turned the pages. Each one was a record. Bundle numbers, denominations, amounts, storage locations. Whoever had kept this ledger had been meticulous, documenting everything, tracking every dollar. And at the bottom of the last page, in that same neat handwriting, was a total. Harold had to read it 3 times before his brain would accept what his eyes were seeing. Total holdings: $234,600,000. The flashlight slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering on the stone floor. The beam rolled across the ground, casting crazy shadows on the walls, illuminating bundles of cash that represented more money than Harold would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. $234 million. Ruth's knees gave out. She sat down hard on the cold floor, the ledger still clutched in her hands, staring at the number like it might change if she looked away and looked back. Harold stood over her, unable to move, unable to think, his entire worldview shattering and reforming around this impossible reality. They had nothing. 3 days ago, they'd been forced from their home with a box of photographs and 2 suitcases. They were living in an abandoned house without heat or running water, eating crackers and instant coffee, facing a winter that might kill them. They'd been betrayed by their children, stripped of everything they'd worked for, reduced to squatters and charity cases, and beneath their feet, hidden in a tunnel no one knew existed, sat a fortune so vast that Harold couldn't comprehend it. More money than their entire town had probably seen in its 100-year history. More money than Michael and Jennifer had stolen, multiplied by millions. Enough money to solve every problem they had 1,000 times over, and still have more left than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. "This isn't real," Ruth said, her voice hollow. "This can't be real. People don't just find this much money. This doesn't happen." But it had happened. They were sitting in a stone vault beneath an abandoned house, surrounded by more wealth than they could process. And it was absolutely, terrifyingly real. Harold sank down beside Ruth, his legs finally giving up the fight to hold him upright. They sat on the cold floor together, the ledger between them, the shelves of money looming around them like silent witnesses to their shock. "What do we do?" Ruth whispered after a long silence. Harold had no answer. His mind felt like it was moving through thick fog, thoughts slow and disconnected. What were they supposed to do? Report it? To who? The police? The FBI? And then what happened to them? Would they be arrested for trespassing? Would they lose access to this house? Their only shelter. Keep it? The thought appeared unbidden, seductive and terrifying. They could take some, just enough to get by, to fix the house, to survive the winter. No one would know. No one even knew this place existed. But whose money was it? Where had it come from? And why was it hidden here? "We need to think," Harold said, his voice hoarse. "We need to go back upstairs. Get out of here. Process this. What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal dangers they never imagined, and force them to make a choice that will define who they really are. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Ruth nodded mechanically. Harold helped her to her feet, and they stood there for another moment, both of them looking around the vault one more time, as if to confirm it was real, that they hadn't imagined it. The bundles of cash sat on their shelves, silent and patient, waiting as they'd been waiting for years, for decades, for someone to find them. Harold picked up his flashlight from the floor and led Ruth back to the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the impossible wealth they were leaving behind. Then he stepped through, pulled the heavy door closed, and spun the wheel lock until it clicked shut. The sound echoed through the tunnel like a judge's gavel, final and ominous. They walked back through the tunnel in silence, Ruth's hand gripping Harold's jacket so tight he could feel her knuckles pressing into his back. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? "How did you talk about finding $234 million when 3 days ago you'd been eating crackers for dinner?" The stone steps seemed steeper going up, Harold's legs shaky, his breath coming in gasps. When they finally emerged into the bedroom, the pale daylight felt too bright. too real after the darkness of the tunnel. Harold replaced the floorboards carefully, covering the entrance, hiding the secret once more. They went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, the same battered table where they'd eaten their meager breakfast just hours ago. Everything looked the same. The camping stove, the cans of food, the cracked windows, the water-stained walls, but nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. $234 million, Ruth said finally, testing the words, seeing how they sounded in the cold morning air. Harold nodded, unable to speak. Harold, we need to think about what this means, where that money came from, because people don't hide that much money unless there's a very good reason. A very bad reason. She was right, of course. Harold's mind was starting to work again, moving past the shock to the implications. That much money, hidden in a secret vault beneath an abandoned house, preserved and maintained for decades. That wasn't someone's life savings. That wasn't lottery winnings or inheritance or any legitimate source of wealth. That was criminal money. It had to be. Drug money, maybe, or mob money. The profits from crimes Harold didn't want to think about. Money that had been hidden away by someone who couldn't risk putting it in a bank, who couldn't let anyone know it existed. Whoever hid it there, Harold said slowly, thinking it through, they must be dead. The house has been abandoned for 20 years. If they were alive, they would have come back for it. Or maybe they're in prison, Ruth countered. Or maybe they told someone about it before they died. Someone who's been looking for it all this time. The thought sent ice through Harold's veins. Someone might be looking for this money. Someone dangerous. Someone who wouldn't care that an elderly couple had stumbled onto it innocently. Someone who would do anything to get it back. We need to report it, Ruth said firmly. We need to call the police. Tell them what we found. Let them handle it. And then what? Harold asked, and he heard the bitterness in his own voice. They'll take it as evidence. They'll investigate. They'll probably investigate us too. Make sure we're not involved somehow, and we'll be kicked out of this house, our only shelter, while they process everything. We'll be right back where we were 3 days ago, with nothing and nowhere to go. Ruth's face was pale. So what are you saying? That we should keep it? That we should become thieves? No, Harold said quickly, though part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, was whispering exactly that. I'm just saying we need to think. We need to be smart. We can't just react. They sat in silence, the magnitude of their discovery pressing down on them. Through the broken window, Harold could hear birds singing. Normal, everyday sounds of a normal, everyday world that suddenly felt very far away. I want to know more, Ruth said finally. About the house. About who owned it. About who might have hidden that money. Before we make any decisions, I want to know what we're dealing with. Harold nodded slowly. It made sense. Knowledge was power, or at least protection. If they were going to make an informed decision about what to do, they needed to understand what they'd found. The county records, he said. Property deeds. Tax documents. There has to be a paper trail. Houses don't just sit abandoned without some kind of history. And we need to be careful, Ruth added. We can't let anyone know what we found. Not yet. Maybe not ever. If word got out, if the wrong people heard about it. She didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. They both understood the danger. 2 elderly people, alone in an isolated house, sitting on top of a fortune that criminals had hidden. It was a recipe for violence, for people getting hurt, for things ending very badly. That afternoon, Harold made his way to the county clerk's office in town, taking the bus that ran twice a day, sitting in the back with his head down, trying to look like just another old man running errands. He told the clerk he was interested in local history, researching old properties for a book he was thinking about writing. The lie came surprisingly easily. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, was happy to help. She pulled up records on the computer, then disappeared into a back room and returned with several folders of older documents that hadn't been digitized yet. "The property at 47 Milner Road," she said, spreading papers across the counter. "Interesting place. Built in 1938 by the Whitmore family. Stayed in that family until 1967, when it was sold to Vincent Moretti." Harold's pen stopped moving. "Vincent Moretti? Yes. Is that name familiar?" Harold shook his head, but his heart was pounding. Moretti, an Italian name, and combined with that much hidden money, it painted a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. The clerk continued, oblivious to Harold's reaction. Vincent Moretti owned the property until his death in 2003. He lived there alone, no family according to these records. The property went into probate, but no heirs ever came forward. It's been abandoned ever since. "What did Mr. Moretti do for a living?" Harold asked carefully. The clerk checked the papers. "Doesn't say specifically. Tax records show he declared income as a business consultant, paid his property taxes every year right up until he died. Heart attack, apparently. Happened very suddenly. A business consultant." Harold wrote that down, but he didn't believe it for a second. Business consultants didn't have $234 million in cash hidden in secret vaults. Did he have any trouble with the law? Any records of arrests or investigations? The clerk gave him an odd look. "That wouldn't be in these files. You'd have to check with the police department for anything like that." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Harold said quickly. "Trying to get a complete picture for my book. You know how it is." He thanked her, took copies of the documents she offered, and left before she could ask more questions. Outside, sitting at the bus stop, he reviewed what he'd learned. Vincent Moretti lived alone for 36 years in that house. Died suddenly in 2003, and no one had been in the house since, which meant the money had been sitting there, undiscovered, for over 20 years. When he got back to the house, Ruth was waiting anxiously. He told her everything he'd learned, and they sat together, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Moretti," Ruth said thoughtfully. "That's definitely Italian. And that much money hidden away. Do you think he was connected to organized crime?" "I think we have to assume that," Harold said. "The timeline fits. The 70s and 80s. That's when a lot of that money was apparently collected, according to the dates in the ledger. That was the height of organized crime in this country." "So he was hiding money for the mob," Ruth said quietly. "And he died before he could tell anyone where it was. Or maybe he was supposed to tell someone and didn't. Maybe that's why it's still there." They looked at each other, and Harold could see his own fear reflected in Ruth's eyes. They'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than they'd imagined. This wasn't just hidden money. This was evidence of decades of criminal activity. Money that had probably been earned through violence and suffering and crimes Harold didn't want to contemplate. "We should report it," Ruth said again, but her voice was less certain now. "It's not ours. It's blood money. We can't keep it." "But what if reporting it puts us in danger?" Harold argued. "What if there are still people out there looking for this money? What if we become targets? We're already in danger just by knowing about it," Ruth pointed out. At least if we report it, the authorities will know. There will be a record. That might protect us. Harold wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. Because she was right, and he knew it. The smart thing, the safe thing, the right thing was to report what they'd found and let the authorities handle it. But another part of him, a part that was growing louder with each passing hour, kept thinking about what that money could do. They could take just enough to fix the house, to buy proper food, to have heat and running water and basic human dignity. No one would miss it. No one even knew it existed. And after everything they'd been through, after everything that had been stolen from them by their own children, didn't they deserve some compensation from the universe? That night, lying on the floor again, Harold couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the vault, to those shelves lined with bundles of cash, to the number in that ledger, $234 million. It was more than he could conceptualize, more than seemed real. Beside him, Ruth was also awake. He could tell by her breathing, shallow and irregular. "Harold," she whispered, in the darkness. "Yeah, I've been thinking about Michael and Jennifer, about what they did to us. And I keep wondering, if they knew about this money, would they report it? Would they do the right thing?" Harold knew the answer to that question. Michael and Jennifer would take every penny without hesitation, without guilt, without a second thought. They'd proven that they valued money more than their parents, more than family, more than basic human decency. They wouldn't, he said quietly. They'd take it and never lose a minute of sleep. "I know," Ruth said. "And I've been lying here feeling angry about that. Angry that they're so selfish, so greedy, so willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want. And then I realized something." She paused, and Harold waited. "I realized I was feeling angry because part of me wants to be like them. Part of me wants to take that money and not care where it came from or who it hurt. Part of me wants to justify it by saying we've suffered enough. We've earned it. We deserve something good after everything bad. And that scared me, Harold. That scared me more than anything. Because if we take that money, even a little bit of it, how are we different from them?" Harold felt tears burning in his eyes, because she'd put into words what he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. The temptation wasn't just about money. It was about becoming something they'd always despised. It was about letting the betrayal change them into the very people who'd betrayed them. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't know yet," Ruth admitted, "but I know we need to pray about it. Really pray. Not just the going through the motions kind. We need guidance, because this is bigger than us. This is about who we are and who we want to be." They prayed together in the darkness, their voices barely whispers, asking for wisdom and strength and protection. And when they finally drifted into exhausted sleep, neither of them had answers, but both of them felt a little less alone. Tomorrow they would have to decide. Report the money and risk losing their only shelter, or keep the secret and risk losing themselves. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after their prayer, Harold woke with a decision crystallizing in his mind. Before they could determine what to do with the money, they needed to know everything about Vincent Moretti. Not just the bare facts from property records, but the real story, who he was, what he'd done, where that money came from. Knowledge was their only protection now, their only weapon against whatever dangers might be lurking in the shadows of this discovery. He told Ruth his plan over weak coffee and stale crackers. "I'm going to the library. They keep old newspapers on microfiche. If Moretti was involved in anything criminal, there might be articles, news stories, something that tells us what we're dealing with. Ruth nodded, her face drawn and tired. She'd slept poorly, Harold could tell. Dark circles under her eyes, making her look older than her 71 years. Be careful. Don't ask too many questions. Don't draw attention. I'll be careful, Harold promised. The county library was a small brick building on Main Street, wedged between a hardware store and a diner that had closed 3 years ago. Harold climbed the steps slowly, his back still aching from nights on the hard floor, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The smell hit him immediately. Old books, dust, and that particular mustiness that comes from decades of printed paper, aging in climate-controlled silence. The librarian was a young woman, maybe 30, with bright red glasses and a friendly smile. Harold gave her the same story he'd given the county clerk, researching local history for a book. She directed him to the microfiche machines in the back corner, showed him how to load the film reels, and left him alone with decades of archived newspapers. Harold started with 2003, the year Moretti died. He scrolled through months of local news, high school sports, town council meetings, obituaries of people he'd never heard of. Then, in April, he found it. Local resident dies suddenly. The article was brief, just 3 paragraphs. Vincent Moretti, 68, found dead in his home on Milner Road. Apparent heart attack. No surviving family. Services private, but it was the last line that made Harold's pulse quicken. Mr. Moretti had lived in the area for over 30 years, after relocating from New Jersey in 1967. New Jersey. Harold wrote that down. He scrolled backward through the years, searching for any other mention of Vincent Moretti. There were a few. A donation to the volunteer fire department in 1995, attendance at a town zoning meeting in 1988. Nothing that suggested criminal activity. Nothing that explained $234 million hidden in a vault. But New Jersey was interesting. Harold knew enough about organized crime history to know that New Jersey had been a major hub in the 60s and 70s. What had brought Vincent Moretti from New Jersey to this isolated corner of nowhere in 1967? He switched to older reels, going back further. 1976, 1972, 1968. The newspapers were yellowed and harder to read. The microfiche scratched from decades of use. And then, in a newspaper from August of 1967, Harold found something that made his hands freeze on the machine controls. The headline read, "Former Associate of Organized Crime Figure Purchases Local Property." Harold's mouth went dry. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting to read the faded text. Vincent Moretti, recently relocated from Newark, New Jersey, has purchased the former Whitmore property on Milner Road. Mr. Moretti's name appeared in federal investigations into organized crime activities in New Jersey between 1962 and 1966, though he was never charged with any crimes. Sources indicate Mr. Moretti served as a financial associate to the Castellano crime family before relocating to our area. Local law enforcement states they will monitor the situation, though Mr. Moretti has committed no crimes in our jurisdiction. Harold read the article 3 times, his heart pounding harder with each pass. The Castellano crime family. Even Harold, who didn't follow organized crime news, recognized that name. They'd been one of the major families operating in the Northeast for decades, and Vincent Moretti had been their financial associate. Financial associate. That was a polite way of saying money launderer. Harold realized. Someone who moved cash, hid assets, kept the family's money safe from federal investigators. Someone who would know exactly how to build a secret vault and fill it with untraceable currency. Harold continued searching, now looking specifically for mentions of the Castellano family. What he found painted a picture that grew darker with each article: racketeering, murder, loan sharking, drug trafficking. The Castellanos had their fingers in every criminal enterprise imaginable, and the money had flowed like a river through the 60s and 70s. Then, in 1986, the family had been largely dismantled by federal prosecutions. Key figures went to prison. Others disappeared or turned state's evidence. The empire crumbled. Billions of dollars in assets seized by the government. But reading between the lines of the articles, Harold understood that not all the money had been found. Rumors persisted of hidden caches, of offshore accounts, of money that had been spirited away before the feds could seize it. Money that Vincent Moretti, the financial associate, might have been responsible for hiding. Harold printed several articles, the old dot matrix printer whirring and clicking, then carefully rewound the microfiche reels. His hands shook as he returned them to their boxes. What he'd discovered was worse than he'd feared. That money in the vault wasn't just criminal proceeds. It was Castellano family money, hidden away during the height of their power, probably meant to be a reserve fund in case things went bad, which they had. But Vincent Moretti had died before he could tell anyone where the money was hidden. Or perhaps he'd chosen not to tell anyone, deciding to take that secret to his grave. Either way, $234 million had been sitting in that vault for decades, unknown and untouched, until now. Until two desperate elderly people had stumbled onto it while looking for shelter. Harold left the library in a daze, the printed articles folded in his pocket, burning against his chest like hot coals. Outside, the autumn sun seemed too bright. The normal street scene of people going about their daily business. Surreal and distant. How could the world just continue normally when he'd discovered something so dangerous, so world-changing? He was halfway to the bus stop when he noticed the car. A black sedan, tinted windows, parked across the street. There was nothing obviously suspicious about it. People parked on Main Street all the time. But something made Harold's instincts scream warning. The car was too clean, too new, too out of place in this small town where most people drove old pickups and beat-up Hondas. Harold forced himself to walk normally. Not to look at the car again. Not to show any sign that he'd noticed it. But his peripheral vision tracked it. And when he reached the bus stop and sat down on the bench, he saw the car was still there. Hadn't moved. The bus came 10 minutes later. Harold climbed aboard, paid his fare, took a seat near the back. As the bus pulled away from the curb, he looked out the window. The black sedan was following. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the car was probably just going in the same direction, that there was no reason to think anyone was watching him, but he couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the cold dread settling into his stomach. When the bus reached the stop nearest Milner Road, Harold got off. He watched as the bus pulled away, and there, 2 blocks back, the black sedan sat idling at the corner. It didn't follow him down the dirt road, at least not immediately. But Harold knew it was there, knew someone was watching. He half ran, half stumbled down the rutted road to the house, his breath coming in gasps, his chest tight with fear and exertion. Ruth met him at the door, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" "Harold, you look terrified." He pulled her inside, closed the door, locked it even though the lock was old and flimsy and wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. Then he told her everything. The articles, Vincent Moretti's connection to the Castellano crime family, the nature of that money sitting in the vault below them, and the black sedan that had followed him from town. Ruth sank into one of the mismatched chairs they'd salvaged from the house, her hand pressed to her mouth. Oh God! Harold, we need to leave. Right now. We need to get out of here. And go where? Harold asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. We have nowhere to go. No money. No options. If we run, we look guilty. If we stay, we might end up dead. Ruth finished, her voice breaking. If that was really someone following you, if someone knows we're here, knows we found that money. They stared at each other, the weight of their situation crushing down on them. They were trapped by poverty, by age, by circumstances they couldn't control. And now, potentially trapped by dangers they couldn't even fully understand. That night, neither of them slept. They sat in the dark house, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. The wind rattling the loose shutters became footsteps. The creaking of old wood settling became someone trying to break in. Every car that passed on the distant highway became the black sedan returning. By morning, they were exhausted and frayed, their nerves stretched to breaking. Ruth's hands trembled as she made coffee, spilling grounds on the counter. Harold sat at the table, the printed articles spread in front of him, reading them again and again as if the words might change, as if he might have misunderstood something crucial. We have to decide, Ruth said finally, setting a cup of weak coffee in front of him. Today, we can't live like this, jumping at shadows, terrified of every noise. We report the money, or we take some and run, or we do something, but we can't just wait for something terrible to happen. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. The knock came again, firmer, more insistent. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan? A voice called from outside. We know you're in there. We need to talk to you. We know you're in there. Harold and Ruth looked at each other in terror. How did they know their names? Who were these people? We're from the County Social Services Office. The voice continued. Your children filed a wellness check request. We just need to make sure you're okay. Relief flooded through Harold, followed immediately by anger. Michael and Jennifer. Of course. They were still trying to control their parents, still trying to force them into that facility, still trying to finish what they'd started. Harold went to the door and opened it a crack, not removing the chain. Two people stood on the porch. A woman in her 40s with a clipboard, and a younger man with kind eyes and a county badge clipped to his belt. Mr. Brennan? I'm Sarah Mitchell from County Social Services. This is Deputy Torres. Your son, Michael, called our office. He's concerned about you and your wife. He says you're living in unsafe conditions. We're fine, Harold said firmly. We don't need any help. Sarah Mitchell glanced past him into the house, taking in the broken windows patched with cardboard, the water-stained walls, the obvious lack of electricity. Sir, with respect, this property doesn't appear to be habitable. There's no power, no heat. Winter's coming. We have resources available. We don't want your resources. Harold interrupted. We're managing. We have shelter. We're not bothering anyone. And question. We're managing Mentiv. In my classes. Deputy Torres stepped forward. Mr. Brennan, we're not here to force you to do anything. But your son has filed paperwork claiming you and your wife are not capable of caring for yourselves. There's going to be a hearing. A judge will decide whether you need to be placed under conservatorship. The word hit Harold like a physical blow. Conservatorship. That's how Michael had taken their house, their savings, and now he was trying to take their freedom, trying to have them declared incompetent so he could control every aspect of their lives. When? Harold asked, his voice hollow. 2 weeks from Monday. You'll receive official notice in the mail. You should get a lawyer if you can afford one. But Harold couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't afford anything. The $200 Dennis had given him was almost gone, spent on food and supplies. They had nothing, and Michael knew it. He was using the system to finish destroying them, to lock them away in that facility where they'd die slowly, forgotten and alone. After the social worker and deputy left, Harold closed the door and leaned against it, feeling like all the strength had drained from his body. Ruth stood in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. He won't stop, she whispered. Michael won't stop until he's taken everything, even our freedom, even our dignity. He wants us locked away where we can't embarrass him, where we can't remind him of what he did. Harold's hands clenched into fists. Rage burned through him, hot and righteous. His son, the boy he'd raised, the child he'd worked himself to exhaustion to provide for, was systematically destroying his parents' lives. And the system was helping him do it. Because having money and a law degree meant Michael's word carried more weight than Harold's entire life of honest work and sacrifice. I'll take some of the money, Harold heard himself say. Not all of it, just enough to hire a lawyer, fight the conservatorship, prove we can take care of ourselves. Ruth looked at him, her eyes red from crying. Harold, we said we wouldn't. That was before, Harold interrupted. Before I knew Michael was trying to have us locked away. Before I knew he'd use every tool at his disposal to finish what he started. Ruth, if we don't fight this, if we can't afford a lawyer, we'll end up in that facility. And we'll die there. Is that what you want? No, Ruth admitted, her voice small. But taking that money, it changes us. It makes us thieves. And Renda, I have my like from self. We're already thieves in everyone's eyes, Harold said bitterly. Michael's told the county we're incompetent. We're squatting in a house we don't own. We have nothing and no one believes in us. What's the difference if we take enough to defend ourselves? Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, How much? 50,000, Harold said. The number had been forming in his mind for days. Enough for a good lawyer. Enough to make basic repairs to this house so it looks habitable. Enough to survive the winter. But not so much that anyone would notice it missing from that vault. And then we report the rest? Ruth asked. Harold hesitated. He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise they'd do the right thing after they'd taken care of themselves. But he couldn't make that promise yet. Couldn't see that far into the future. Let's just get through this hearing first. One step at a time. That afternoon, Harold descended into the tunnel alone. Ruth couldn't bring herself to go down there again. Couldn't face the temptation of all that money sitting in the darkness. Harold moved through the stone passage with his flashlight, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he opened the vault door and stepped inside, the money seemed to reproach him. All those bundles, wrapped and preserved, representing decades of crime and violence and suffering. And he was about to become part of that chain, about to benefit from money that had been earned through others' pain. But he thought about Michael's face in that lawyer's office, Jennifer's cold indifference, the social worker's pitying expression, The judge who would decide whether Harold and Ruth were capable of living their own lives. And he reached for the first bundle. He worked methodically, taking bundles from different shelves, different locations, making sure not to create obvious gaps. 10 bundles here, 5 there, 3 from that corner. Each bundle was $10,000. When he'd collected 50 bundles, he stopped and forced himself to step back from the shelves. $50,000. It felt like nothing compared to the total. A rounding error in 234 million. But it also felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. Becoming something he'd sworn he'd never be. Harold loaded the bundles into a backpack he'd found in the house. Old canvas that smelled of mildew but would hold the weight. Then he closed the vault door, spun the lock, and climbed back up to the house. Ruth was waiting in the kitchen, her Bible open on the table in front of her, though Harold could tell she wasn't reading. When she saw the backpack, her face crumpled. "It's done," Harold said quietly. "We're thieves now." "No," Ruth said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We're survivors. We're taking what we need to protect ourselves. That's different." But they both knew it wasn't different. Not really. They'd made a choice, and that choice would define them from this moment forward. Over the next 3 days, they hid the money carefully throughout the house, some behind loose boards in the walls, some beneath floorboards in different rooms, some in the old chimney. If anyone came looking, they wouldn't find everything in one place. Harold used $5,000 to hire a lawyer, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who practiced out of a small office above a dry cleaner, 2 towns over. Chen listened to their story, made notes, and said he'd do what he could to fight the conservatorship. "But I'll be honest with you," Chen said. "These cases are hard to win. Your son is successful, respected, and he's already established legal standing. You're elderly. You're living in what the county has documented as an unsafe dwelling, and you have no income beyond a small pension. A judge is going to look at this and think your son is doing the right thing, even though he stole from us?" Harold asked. "Even though he forced us out of our home? And, quote, Hazapaya Opai." Chen shrugged. "He'll say he was protecting you, that you signed the papers willingly, that he was acting in your best interest. And unless you can prove otherwise, unless you can show financial abuse and elder exploitation, which requires documentation you probably don't have, the judge will likely believe him." Harold and Ruth left the lawyer's office feeling more defeated than when they'd arrived. Even with money for legal help, they were fighting an uphill battle against a system designed to protect the wealthy and successful, not the old and vulnerable. That evening, as they ate canned soup heated on the camping stove, there was another knock at the door. Harold's blood ran cold. Were the social workers back? The police? Or worse, had the black sedan returned? He approached the door cautiously, looked through the crack. Standing on the porch was Dennis, but he wasn't alone. 2 men stood behind him, both wearing dark suits and expressions that made Harold's instincts scream danger. Harold opened the door. "Dennis? What's going on?" Dennis looked uncomfortable, wouldn't meet Harold's eyes. "Harold, I'm sorry. These men came to my apartment. They were asking about you. They knew we were friends. I had to bring them here. Or they said they'd—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." One of the men stepped forward. He was maybe 50, with silver at his temples and eyes like a shark's, flat and cold. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Anthony Russo. I represent certain business interests that have reason to believe you may have found something that doesn't belong to you." Harold's mouth went dry. This was it. This was what he'd feared. Somehow, they knew about the money. But how? How could they possibly know? "I don't know what you're talking about," Harold said, trying to keep his voice steady. Russo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Brennan, let's not play games. We know Vincent Moretti lived in this house. We know he died without revealing the location of certain assets. Assets that belong to our organization. And we know that this house has been thoroughly searched multiple times over the past 20 years with no success." He paused, letting that sink in. "But then you and your wife move in. You start asking questions at the library, looking up old newspaper articles about Vincent and his associates. That kind of curiosity makes us wonder what you might have found." Harold's mind raced. The library. They'd been watching the library. Or maybe they had someone working there. Someone who'd noticed his searches and reported back. He'd been so careful. Or thought he had been. But he'd left a trail anyway. "We haven't found anything," Harold said. "We were just curious about who used to live here. That's all." Class. The second man stepped forward, larger than Russo, with hands like sledgehammers and a face that had seen violence and dealt it out regularly. "Mr. Brennan, we can do this easy or hard." "Easy. You tell us what you found, show us where it is, and you and your wife walk away with your lives, and maybe even a small finder's fee. Hard. Well, accidents happen. Especially to old folks living in unsafe conditions." The threat was clear, unmistakable. Harold felt Ruth come up behind him, her hand gripping his arm. "We need time to think," Harold said. Amazed, his voice didn't shake. "To discuss this. Give us 1 day." Russo considered this, then nodded. 24 hours. Then we come back, and you tell us what we want to know. And Mr. Brennan, don't think about calling the police. These assets were obtained through means that would implicate you as well. You took something that doesn't belong to you. That makes you a thief, just like everyone else involved. The law won't protect you." They left, Dennis stumbling after them, with one last apologetic look back at Harold. When they were gone, Harold closed and locked the door, though he knew that flimsy lock would do nothing against men like that. Ruth was shaking, her face white. "Harold, they're going to kill us. Whether we tell them or not, they're going to kill us because we know about the money." Harold knew she was right. Men like Russo didn't leave witnesses. If they gave up the location of the vault, they'd be murdered as soon as Russo verified the money was there. If they didn't, they'd be tortured until they talked, then murdered anyway. They were trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. "We run," Harold said suddenly. "Tonight, we take whatever cash we can carry, and we run. Get as far from here as we can." "They'll find us," Ruth said. "Men like that, they have resources. They'll track us down, maybe. But at least we'll have a chance. If we stay here, we have no chance at all." They spent the next hour frantically packing what little they owned, stuffing cash into their clothes, into Ruth's Bible, anywhere it might be hidden if they were searched. Harold took 50,000 more from the vault, knowing it was dangerous, but knowing they'd need money to disappear, to start over somewhere far away. But as they prepared to leave, as Harold was checking the windows one last time to make sure no one was watching, Ruth said something that stopped him cold. "Harold, there's another option. We could report everything. Right now. Call the FBI. Tell them about the vault, about Russo, about all of it. They'd have to protect us. We'd be witnesses." Harold turned to look at her. You want to trust the government, the same system that's letting Michael have us declared incompetent. I want to survive, Ruth said simply, and I want to do it without compromising everything we believe in. We've already taken money that isn't ours. We've already become thieves. If we run, if we use that money to disappear, we become exactly what Russo said we are, criminals. Is that who we want to be? Harold sank into a chair, the weight of the decision crushing him. Run, and possibly survive, but lose their souls in the process. Or report everything, and possibly survive, while keeping their integrity, but risk retaliation from both the mob and from Michael's legal maneuvering. Either way, the odds weren't good. Either way, they might end up dead. But one way let them look at themselves in the mirror. If we report it, Harold said slowly, we lose this house. They'll seize it as evidence. We'll have nowhere to go again. The FBI has witness protection. Ruth countered. They'd relocate us. Give us new identities. Maybe that's better anyway. Maybe that's what we need. A complete fresh start where Michael can't find us, where the mob can't find us. Harold looked at his wife. This woman who'd stood beside him for 53 years, who'd been broken and beaten down by betrayal, but who still had strength he couldn't comprehend. She was right. She was always right about the important things. Okay, he said finally. We call the FBI. We tell them everything. And we hope to God they can protect us from what comes next. But even as he agreed, even as Ruth reached for the phone to make the call that would change everything, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they'd already lost. That somewhere in the chain of events that had led them to this abandoned house and the fortune hidden beneath it, they'd taken a wrong turn from which there was no recovery. The only question now was whether they'd survive long enough to find out if they'd made the right choice. Ruth's hand trembled as she picked up the phone. It was an old landline they'd found in the house, surprisingly still connected, probably because the county had never bothered to disconnect it after Vincent Moretti died. She dialed 911, and Harold stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them knowing that this single call would change everything. I need to speak to the FBI, Ruth said when the dispatcher answered. My husband and I have discovered something. A large amount of money. We believe it's connected to organized crime. And there are dangerous people who know we found it. We need help. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately from routine to alert. Ma'am, stay on the line. I'm connecting you now. Within minutes, Ruth was speaking to an FBI agent at the field office 3 hours away. She told him everything, Harold leaning close to add details. Vincent Moretti, the Castellano family connection, the vault beneath the house containing $234 million in cash, Anthony Russo's visit, and his threats. The timeline of how they'd discovered it, how they'd researched it, how they'd taken some out of desperation, but were prepared to return it all. Stay where you are, the agent said, his voice tense with urgency. Don't leave the house. Don't let anyone in. We're sending a team immediately. They'll be there in 2 hours. Can you stay safe for 2 hours? We'll try, Harold said, looking at the flimsy door, the broken windows, the complete lack of security in this falling down house. The next 2 hours were the longest of their lives. They sat together on the floor, backs against the wall, watching the door and windows, jumping at every sound. Harold had found an old tire iron, the only weapon in the house, and he clutched it in his hands, even though he knew it would be useless against men like Russo and his partner. Did we do the right thing? Ruth whispered in the darkness. I don't know, Harold admitted, but it's the only thing we could do, and still be us. Still be the people we raised our children to be, even if they didn't learn the lesson. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm scared. Me too. They heard the vehicles before they saw them. Multiple cars, coming fast down the dirt road. Harold's heart hammered as he peered through a crack in the boarded window. But these weren't black sedans with tinted windows. These were official vehicles, marked and unmarked. FBI emblazoned on the sides of some of them. The agents who entered the house were professional and efficient. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Mitchell, different from the social worker, examined their IDs, asked quick pointed questions, and then said, "Show us the vault." Harold led them upstairs, pulled up the floorboards, revealed the stone steps descending into darkness. 6 agents descended, weapons drawn, not knowing what they might find. Harold and Ruth waited in the bedroom, surrounded by other agents, protected but also watched carefully. Still suspects until their story could be verified. 20 minutes later, Agent Mitchell emerged from the tunnel, her face showing shock despite her professional training. "It's real," she said into her radio. "Send the forensic accounting team, and we need evidence techs. Lots of them." She turned to Harold and Ruth. "You're going to need to come with us. Protective custody until we can assess the threat level. Pack whatever you need for a few days." "A few days?" Ruth asked. "What happens after that depends on what we find down there and who else might be looking for it. But Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know you did the right thing calling us. That took courage. A lot of people wouldn't have." Over the next week, Harold and Ruth lived in a safe house, a nondescript apartment in a city they weren't told the name of, guarded 24 hours a day by federal agents. They watched the news obsessively. The story broke on the 3rd day. Massive cash seizure, linked to organized crime. Discovery in abandoned house leads to new investigations into decades-old criminal enterprises. The news didn't mention Harold and Ruth by name, just described them as elderly occupants who reported the discovery to authorities. Agent Mitchell visited them regularly, keeping them updated. The forensic accountants were cataloging every bundle of cash in the vault. The total matched what Harold had read in the ledger: $234,600,000. The FBI had arrested Anthony Russo and 5 associates, charging them with making terroristic threats and attempting to recover proceeds from criminal enterprises. The investigation was expanding, looking into who else might have known about the money, who else might have been searching for it. "What happens to the money?" Ruth asked during one of these visits. "It's evidence for now," Mitchell explained. "Eventually, it'll be forfeited to the government. But there's something called the Asset Forfeiture and Sharing Program. People who provide information that leads to the seizure of criminal assets can receive a reward, typically up to 25% of the total recovered." Harold's hands started shaking. 25% of $234 million. That was almost $60 million. The number was so incomprehensible it didn't feel real. "We don't want that much," Ruth said immediately. "That's not why we reported it." Mitchell smiled slightly. "I know. Your actions have made that clear. But the law allows for it. And frankly, you've earned it. You could have kept that money. You took only enough to survive and hired a lawyer to fight what sounds like a legitimate case of elder abuse. Then, when threatened, you did the right thing instead of running. That's exactly the kind of behavior we want to reward." "How much would be enough?" "To make sure we're never homeless again," Harold asked quietly. "To have a small house, heat, food, To help a few other people who've been where we've been. Mitchell considered this. The reward amount is determined by the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I can make recommendations. What if we proposed $1 million? It's enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. Help others. Make a real difference. But it's not so much that you lose yourselves in it. Tax and prizes. Harold and Ruth looked at each other. $1 million. After having nothing, after being stripped of everything, it seemed like a fortune. But after seeing $234 million sitting in that vault, it also seemed reasonable, proportional, fair. We'd want most of it to go to helping other elderly people, Ruth said. People who've been financially abused by family members. People who've been abandoned. Can we do that? You can do whatever you want with it, Mitchell said. It's yours. The legal proceedings took months to resolve. The conservatorship hearing that Michael had initiated was postponed, then eventually dismissed, when Robert Chen, their lawyer, presented evidence of the FBI investigation and Harold and Ruth's cooperation with federal authorities. Hard to argue someone was incompetent when they'd made decisions that led to the largest organized crime asset seizure in the region's history. During this time, Harold and Ruth lived in temporary housing provided by the FBI Witness Protection Program. Not full witness protection with new identities, but enough security to keep them safe while the investigations proceeded, and while the various organized crime figures connected to the Castellano family's old operations were rounded up and prosecuted. It was during this time, in a small apartment with clean walls and working heat and food in the refrigerator, that Harold and Ruth began to heal. The constant fear that had gripped them since the betrayal began to ease. They slept in real beds. They ate regular meals. They talked for hours about what they wanted to do, who they wanted to become after this was all over. I don't want to just survive anymore, Ruth said one evening, looking out the window at a sunset they could actually enjoy without fear. I want to live. Really live. And I want what happened to us to mean something. To help others, so they don't have to suffer the way we did. A foundation, Harold said, the idea forming as he spoke. We set up a foundation specifically for elderly people who've been financially abused by family members. Legal help, emergency housing, counseling, everything we needed but didn't have. Ruth's eyes lit up. That spark Harold had feared was gone forever, now burning bright again. Yes, we call it the Second Chances Foundation, because everyone deserves a second chance, no matter how old they are, no matter how badly they've been betrayed. They spent the next weeks planning, working with lawyers the FBI connected them with, setting up the structure of what would become their life's mission. When the U.S. Attorney's Office officially awarded them $1 million as their share of the asset forfeiture, Harold and Ruth immediately committed $700,000 of it to establishing the foundation. The remaining $300,000 would be enough to buy a small house, live comfortably, and have security for the first time in their lives. But before they could truly move forward, there was something they needed to do. Something painful but necessary. They needed to confront Michael and Jennifer. The meeting was arranged through lawyers, held in a conference room in a downtown office building. Michael and Jennifer arrived separately. Jennifer with her new boyfriend, Michael alone and looking older than his 47 years, worn down by the scandal of what he'd done and the very public revelation of how his parents had discovered a fortune and given most of it away to help others. Harold and Ruth sat on one side of the table, their lawyer Robert Chen beside them. Michael and Jennifer sat across from them, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Harold broke the silence. I didn't ask for this meeting to yell at you or to hear apologies I don't think you're capable of giving. I asked for it because I needed you to hear something from me directly. Not through lawyers or news stories or second-hand reports. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer stared at the table. What you did to us was wrong, Harold continued, his voice steady and strong. You took everything we had. You threw us away like garbage. You tried to have us locked away in a facility where we would have died alone and forgotten. And you did it not because you thought it was best for us, but because you wanted what little we had left, and because we inconvenienced you, Dad. Michael started, but Harold held up his hand. I'm not finished. We found money, a fortune, more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. And we gave almost all of it to the government because it wasn't ours. We kept only enough to live and to help others who've suffered what we suffered. Do you understand what that means? He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Michael's, then Jennifer's. It means we had everything you thought you wanted, everything you destroyed our lives to get a fraction of, and we chose to give it away. Because we're not you. We never were you. We raised you better than you became. And that's a failure we'll carry for the rest of our lives. Ruth spoke for the first time. Her voice quiet, but clear. We forgive you, not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger and hate would poison us, and you've already taken enough from us. We won't give you our peace too. Jennifer started crying. Whether from guilt or self-pity, Harold couldn't tell and didn't care. Michael's jaw was clenched, so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. But, Harold continued, we never want to see you again. You're no longer our children. You made that choice when you betrayed us. We're legally removing you as beneficiaries from anything we have. When we die, whatever is left goes to the foundation. You'll get nothing. Not because we want revenge, but because you've shown us who you are, and we don't reward cruelty and greed. They stood to leave. At the door, Ruth turned back one final time. I hope you have children someday, and I hope they treat you exactly the way you treated us. Because maybe then you'll understand what you've done. Maybe then you'll learn the lesson we tried so hard to teach you. As they left the conference room, Harold felt something lift from his chest, a weight he'd been carrying since that day in the lawyer's office when his children had destroyed his life. They couldn't undo what Michael and Jennifer had done, but they could choose not to be defined by it, not to let it make them bitter or small or cruel. They could choose to be bigger than their pain. And they had. 6 months later, Harold and Ruth stood in front of a small but sturdy house on the edge of a town 3 states away from where they'd started. The house had 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen with working appliances, heat that functioned, and a porch where they could sit and watch the birds. It cost $175,000, paid in cash, the first home they'd owned since losing everything. But more importantly, in a renovated office building downtown, the Second Chances Foundation opened its doors. They'd hired staff, people who understood elder abuse because they'd experienced it or witnessed it. They'd set up a hotline, advertised in senior centers and churches and community centers. They offered free legal consultations, emergency housing assistance, counseling services, and financial planning help. The response was overwhelming. In the first month alone, they received over 300 calls from elderly people across the state who'd been financially exploited by family members. People who'd had their savings drained, their houses stolen, their lives destroyed by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. Harold and Ruth worked tirelessly, not as figureheads but as active participants. They met with clients, shared their own story, showed others that survival was possible, that rebuilding was possible, that life after betrayal could still have meaning and purpose and joy. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Margaret came into the foundation's office. She was 63, had been caring for her disabled son for 20 years, and her daughter had drained her bank account and was trying to force her into a nursing home to get control of her house. Ruth sat with her for 2 hours, holding her hand while she cried, sharing her own story of betrayal and survival. Then they connected Margaret with a lawyer, helped her file the necessary paperwork to recover her stolen funds, and found her temporary housing, while the legal case proceeded. 3 months later, Margaret won her case. Her daughter was charged with elder financial abuse. Margaret got her money back and kept her house. But more than that, she got her dignity back, her sense of self-worth, the knowledge that she mattered and deserved protection and respect. She returned to the foundation with a donation, small but meaningful, and a request. Let me volunteer. Let me help other people the way you helped me. Let me give back. That became the pattern. People they helped often returned to help others, creating a ripple effect of compassion and support. Within a year, the Second Chances Foundation had helped over 1,000 elderly people across 3 states. They'd recovered over $5 million in stolen assets, prevented dozens of forced conservatorships, and provided emergency housing to hundreds of people who'd been made homeless by family betrayal. The work was hard, emotionally exhausting, a constant reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But it was also deeply fulfilling, a reminder of humanity's capacity for resilience and kindness and transformation. Harold and Ruth's story spread. Media outlets picked it up. Elderly couple betrayed by children finds fortune, gives it away to help others. They were invited to speak at conferences about elder abuse, to testify before state legislatures about the need for stronger protections, to share their story with anyone who would listen. But they never lost sight of who they were. They still lived in their modest house, still did their own grocery shopping, still sat on the porch in the evenings watching birds and holding hands. They didn't want fame or recognition. They just wanted to make sure that what had happened to them didn't keep happening to others. One evening, 2 years after they'd found the vault beneath that abandoned house, Harold and Ruth sat on their porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They'd just returned from the Foundation's 2nd anniversary celebration, where they'd announced they'd helped over 3,000 people and recovered more than $15 million in stolen assets. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd kept the money?" Harold asked. "If we'd taken it and run, lived rich and comfortable for the rest of our lives?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "We wouldn't have been us anymore. We would have become them. Michael and Jennifer. Taking what isn't theirs, justifying it, living with guilt and shame, buried so deep they don't even recognize it anymore. Instead, we became this," Harold said, gesturing to the Foundation's brochure on the table beside them, showing photos of people they'd helped, testimonials from clients whose lives had been saved. "We became people who matter," Ruth said softly. "Not because we're rich or famous or successful by the world's standards, but because we chose to turn our pain into purpose. We chose to make sure our suffering meant something." Harold reached over and took her hand, still soft despite the years, still the hand he'd held on their wedding day 55 years ago. "I love you, and I'm proud of us, of what we built from nothing, from worse than nothing." Ruth corrected. "We were broken, betrayed, homeless. And look at us now. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the porch light attracting moths and the evening chorus of crickets filling the air. Inside the house, real heat kept them warm. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was full of food. In the bedroom, a real bed with clean sheets waited. Simple things, basic things, but things they'd learned never to take for granted again. The next morning, Ruth got a call from a woman in tears. Her name was Patricia, 76 years old, and her son had forged her signature on documents transferring her house to his name. She was being evicted from the home she'd lived in for 40 years, given 30 days to get out, nowhere to go, and no way to fight. "We can help," Ruth said immediately. "Come to our office today. Bring whatever documents you have. We'll figure this out together." After she hung up, Harold looked at her and smiled. "Another one saved. Another one given a second chance," Ruth corrected. "The way we were given one." By the Foundation's 5th anniversary, they'd helped over 10,000 people. The work had expanded to 12 states, with satellite offices and partner organizations spreading the mission. Harold was 78 now, Ruth was 76, and their hair was whiter, their steps slower, but their purpose burned as bright as ever. They'd been invited to the White House to receive a Presidential Citizens Medal for their work combating elder abuse. Standing in that formal room, shaking the president's hand, Harold thought about the journey that had led them there. From the lawyer's office where their children had destroyed them, to the abandoned house where they'd nearly frozen, to the vault that had tested their character, to this moment where they were being honored for choosing integrity over wealth. "You've shown America what true character looks like," the president said during the ceremony. "When faced with unimaginable temptation and desperate circumstances, you chose to do what was right. You've helped thousands of vulnerable elderly people and inspired millions more. You remind us that it's never too late to make a difference, that betrayal doesn't have to define us, and that second chances are possible at any age." That night, back in their hotel room, Harold and Ruth watched the news coverage of the ceremony. The reporters told their story. The betrayal, the discovery, the choice to report the money, the foundation they'd built. "We've become a story," Ruth said wonderingly. "A lesson about integrity and resilience." "Good," Harold said. "Maybe it'll help someone else who's facing impossible choices. Maybe they'll remember us and choose differently than they might have." The years continued to pass. The foundation grew stronger, more professional, more effective. Harold and Ruth eventually stepped back from day-to-day operations, letting younger, more energetic people take over while they served as advisors and the public face of the mission. They traveled a little, something they'd never been able to afford before. Not extravagantly, but comfortably. They visited national parks, saw the ocean, went to places they'd only read about in books, and everywhere they went, people recognized them from news stories, stopped them to say thank you, to share their own stories of betrayal and survival, to tell them how much hope they'd provided. One afternoon, 7 years after everything had started, Harold and Ruth received an unexpected visitor at their house. A young man, maybe 30, stood on their porch, looking nervous and uncertain. "Can I help you?" Harold asked. "Mr. Brennan? Mrs. Brennan? My name is Nathan. I'm Michael's son, your grandson." Harold's chest tightened. He hadn't seen Nathan since he was a teenager, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. "What do you want?" Nathan shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize for my father, for what he did. I was away at college when it all happened. I didn't know the full story until years later. And when I found out, when I really understood what they'd done to you, I was ashamed. Ashamed to be their son. Ashamed that I'd benefited from money they stole from you. Ruth appeared in the doorway, studying this young man who carried their blood but had been raised by people they no longer recognized. I have a daughter now, Nathan continued, his voice breaking slightly. She's 2 years old, and I look at her, and I think about how I want to raise her, what values I want to teach her. And I realized I don't want her to learn from my parents. I want her to learn from you. From people who chose integrity, even when it cost them everything. He pulled out an envelope. This isn't enough. Could never be enough. But I've been saving. Every month, I put money aside. It's $20,000. I want to donate it to your foundation. And I want to volunteer, if you'll let me. I want to help undo some of the damage my family caused. Harold and Ruth looked at each other. One of their long, silent conversations. They saw in Nathan something they'd lost in Michael and Jennifer. Conscience. Empathy. The understanding that family was supposed to mean something beyond transactions and obligations. Come inside, Ruth said finally, opening the door wider. Let's talk. Nathan became a regular volunteer at the foundation, then eventually joined the board of directors. He brought his daughter to visit Harold and Ruth regularly, and they became the grandparents they'd never been allowed to be, teaching her about kindness and sacrifice and doing the right thing even when it was hard. Michael and Jennifer never reached out, never apologized, never acknowledged what they'd done. Harold and Ruth heard through Nathan that Jennifer had remarried and moved across the country. Michael had lost his law license due to ethics violations related to how he'd handled his parents' assets. He worked as a paralegal now, bitter and diminished, his life a shadow of what it had once been. Harold felt no satisfaction in this, just a deep sadness for the waste of it all, for the choices that had led to such destruction, for the relationship that could have been but never would be. On their 60th wedding anniversary, the foundation threw a celebration. Over 500 people attended. People they'd helped, volunteers, staff members, donors, advocates from across the country who'd joined the fight against elder abuse. The walls were lined with photos and testimonials, stories of lives saved and families preserved, and justice achieved. Harold stood at the microphone, Ruth beside him, and looked out at the crowd. When Ruth and I found ourselves homeless and betrayed, sleeping on the floor of an abandoned house, we thought our lives were over. We thought we'd lost everything that mattered. He paused, his throat tight with emotion. But we were wrong. What we'd lost were just things. A house, some money, the illusion that our children loved us. What we still had, what we'd always had, were our values, our integrity, our capacity to choose who we wanted to be when everything else was stripped away. Ruth took his hand and continued. We found a fortune hidden beneath that house. $234 million. And yes, we were tempted. God knows we were tempted. But we realized that keeping money earned through others' suffering would make us no different from the people who'd hurt us. It would make us into something we weren't willing to become. So we gave it back, Harold said. And with our small portion, we built this foundation, this community, this movement of people who believe elderly people deserve dignity and protection and second chances. He looked around the room, at faces young and old, at people of every background and circumstance united by a common cause. We've helped over 15,000 people now. We've recovered over $50 million in stolen assets. We've prevented hundreds of wrongful conservatorships. We've provided emergency housing to thousands. But more than that, we've shown people that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something better, something meaningful, something that lasts. The crowd rose to their feet, applause filling the room. Harold and Ruth stood together, overwhelmed by what they'd built from the ashes of their destruction, by the lives they'd touched, by the legacy they were leaving. Because that's what this had become, a legacy, not of wealth or fame or power, but of character, of choosing light when darkness seemed overwhelming, of turning pain into purpose, of proving that it's never too late to make a difference, never too late to start over, never too late to become who you were always meant to be. As the celebration wound down and people began to leave, an elderly woman approached Harold and Ruth. She was maybe 80, with kind eyes and hands twisted by arthritis. "I just wanted to thank you," she said simply. "My son stole my life savings last year. $200,000 I'd saved over 40 years. I was going to give up, just accept it, and live out my days in poverty. But then I heard your story, and I thought, if they can survive and fight back, so can I." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Your foundation helped me. We got my money back. My son is in prison, and I'm living in my own apartment, safe and secure. You saved my life. Not just my money, my actual life. I was planning to end it before I called your hotline, but you gave me hope. You showed me I mattered." Ruth hugged her, both women crying now. "You do matter. You always mattered. And we're so glad you fought. So glad you're still here." After the woman left, Harold and Ruth stood alone in the empty hall, surrounded by the photos and stories that represented their life's work. "We did it," Harold said quietly. "We took the worst thing that ever happened to us and turned it into the best thing we ever did." Ruth nodded, leaning against him. "I wouldn't choose to go through it again. The betrayal, the pain, all of it. But I also wouldn't change where we ended up. Because this purpose, this meaning, it's worth everything we lost." They turned off the lights and walked out into the cool evening air. Their car, a modest sedan they'd bought used, waited in the parking lot. They drove home to their small house, the one they'd paid cash for, the one that would never be taken from them, the one that represented security and safety, and the knowledge that they'd earned every square inch through their choices and their character. That night, lying in bed, Ruth said, "Harold, do you think people will remember us after we're gone?" Harold thought about this carefully. "Some will. The people we helped directly, they'll remember. The foundation will carry on. But that's not really what matters. What matters then? That we lived according to our values. That when we were tested in the hardest way possible, we didn't break. That we chose integrity over wealth, compassion over bitterness, purpose over comfort. Whether anyone remembers our names doesn't matter. What matters is that we proved it was possible. That we showed others a different way." Ruth smiled in the darkness. "Then we succeeded." "Yeah," Harold agreed. "Anyone can find money if fortune smiles on them. But discovering who you really are when everything is stripped away, when temptation is overwhelming and circumstances are desperate, that's the real treasure." Harold and Ruth Brennan found that treasure not in a vault beneath an abandoned house, but within themselves. They found strength they didn't know they possessed, integrity they refused to compromise, and purpose that transformed their pain into power. They'd been betrayed by their children, made homeless, reduced to nothing. But from that nothing, they'd built something extraordinary. Not a fortune, though they'd touched one briefly. Not fame, though their story had spread far and wide. They'd built a legacy of character, proof that second chances are possible at any age, that cruelty doesn't have to be answered with cruelty, and that the right choice is always worth making, even when it costs you everything. The abandoned house where they'd found the money was eventually torn down, deemed structurally unsound. The tunnel was sealed, the vault dismantled, the site reclaimed by the forest. But what Harold and Ruth had built, the foundation and the movement, and the thousands of lives touched by their choice, that would endure long after they were gone. Because in the end, they discovered something worth more than $234 million. They discovered that betrayal could be transformed into purpose, that suffering could become strength, and that two elderly people with nothing but their integrity could change the world. That's not just their story. It's a reminder for all of us that we're defined not by what happens to us, but by how we respond, not by what we lose, but by what we choose to build from the ruins, not by the betrayals we endure, but by the grace with which we survive them. Harold and Ruth Brennan started with nothing and ended with everything that matters. And their legacy lives on in every person who hears their story and chooses integrity over easy answers, compassion over bitterness, and purpose over comfort. Because some treasures can't be stolen, can't be lost, can't be taken away by cruel children or hidden in vaults or seized by governments. The treasure of character, of knowing who you are and refusing to compromise it, that's yours forever. And that's worth more than all the money in the world. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe integrity is worth more than wealth, and that it's never too late for a second chance.